Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. I'm Jennifer, in case you're new here. Today we're going to be talking specifically about 7 things that I am doing this year in the garden for food security. The first step we're taking this year for food security that kind of goes above and beyond what we normally do is we are getting a lot more serious about composting. You can see our new composting bin system behind me. Now you can see this is not the most beautiful compost system. This is not the most professional looking compost system. You can definitely get much more fancy than this. You can definitely use pallets that are not falling apart. If you have access to really good condition pallets, you can make a much better system than we have. But what we did was we used the resources that we have, and we've kind of always dabbled in compost in the past, but we've never really made enough for our needs. We've always had to supplement with purchased compost. And this year we're trying to get a lot more serious about really making our own compost. So one of the biggest expenses when you're gardening is soil. If you're not starting with great soil, you're going to have to purchase soil, and amending with compost is a great way to get your soil up to where it wants to be. Now, I know you're here looking at my compost pile. It's not all that beautiful. I mean, finished compost is a beautiful thing. Compost in process, not so much. But this is going to really give our vegetables in our garden next year the real nutrient boost that they need. Now, having healthy soil is probably the single biggest predictor of how well your garden is going to do. And so it's really important to make sure that your soil is healthy and to give your plants the nutrients that they need to grow. And if you're always relying on an outside source for that compost, that kind of isn't the best way to go for food security. And so while purchased compost is great, and there is definitely nothing wrong with purchasing compost, we've purchased compost for many years and we've been happy with the results. But since we're trying to become a little more self-sufficient, a little more sustainable, kind of increase our food security, what we're trying to do is we're trying to close our system a little bit more so that we produce more of our own compost and we aren't as dependent on outside sources for our compost. Now, I will say in the past we've kind of always dabbled in it. We're still not being super scientific about it. Now, you can really get into the ratios of the browns to the greens and high nitrogen compost. There are some great things that you can do, and that will give you the best compost possible in the shortest amount of time. If you really want to be efficient, that's the way to do it. But that's not really the approach we're taking because honestly, right now, we just don't have the time and the resources to really focus on that fully. Down the road, I would love to really get into that and to really make the best quality compost the most efficient way possible. But for the moment, we're just doing what we have. We're adding our chicken bedding in here. We're adding all of our spent garden plants. We're adding our vegetable-based food scraps in here. And my daughter has a pet rabbit. We're adding the rabbit bedding and poop in here as well. We're just kind of turning it as we go. And this will break down. It's not the most efficient, but it's still going to be really high quality compost. Now, kind of a quick overview of how our composting system works. You can see that we have 3 separate bins in this compost system here. So this bin we're not adding stuff to anymore. You can see it's kind of sunken down because a lot of this stuff is really starting to break down. We're just going to let that be and break down and turn it. That's going to be the first compost that we'll use. We'll probably put that on some of our beds in the fall once we pull plants out of them. Over here, this is currently the bin that we're adding things to. And then we have a 3rd bin over here. You can see there's a little bit in there, but we're not really actively doing anything with that right now. The goal is that once this fills up, we'll start adding to this, and then we'll be taking from the first one here. Now, I did a whole video showing the build of this compost system. That is a throwback video. It is the very first video that I ever recorded. It's not the first video that I posted on YouTube, but it's the very first one that we ever recorded. So if you want to check out that video, go check it out. There's some good information in there, but just bear with me because that's the very first video I ever recorded, as I said. So just give me a little grace on that one there. Now, if you don't have space for a composting system like this, or maybe you don't have enough scraps to fill a composting system like this, you can definitely compost on a smaller scale. Our garden is fairly small. There are so many people out there that compost on a much larger scale than we do. We're kind of in the middle. But if you don't have a lot of space, say if you just have a really small garden, if you have a small apartment and you don't even have any yard space for compost, you can look into vermicomposting. That is a great option for people with limited space. You can compost completely contained within your house. Now, I personally do not have any experience vermicomposting. That is something that I would love to get into in the future. So that's kind of on the to-do list down the road. So if you have any great resources that you want to recommend to me or to anyone else who might be interested in getting into vermicomposting, feel free to leave those in the comments below. I would love to check them out, and I'm sure other people would as well. So my second big tip this year for really focusing on food security in the garden is saving seeds. Now, knowing how to save seeds is a really important skill if you want your garden to really be self-sustainable, if you want to not be dependent on a seed company for sourcing your seeds every year. Now, there's a lot of reasons why you might want to save seeds. One of the biggest ones is just because it's going to save you a lot of money. Seed packets don't really seem like they would be that expensive. You know, it's a couple dollars for a seed packet. It seems pretty cheap, and for what you get, it really is. But when you think about, especially when you have a bigger garden, when you think about how many different types of seeds you're going to need, especially if you're like me and you need to grow all the kinds of tomatoes and all the kinds of cucumbers, and you just don't want to grow just one or two kinds, it can really add up and get expensive. So saving your own seeds is a great way to save yourself some money. Now, when it comes to food security, one of the important reasons to save seeds is just so that you know you have that source of seeds that you can count on. Now, during 2020, as everyone knows, the world kind of got turned upside down a little bit. Things changed a lot. And during that time, a lot of people really became focused on gardening. And now seed companies weren't really prepared for the amount of demand that was placed on them. And so a lot of seed companies sold out of a lot of their stock and had shortages. People had really long wait times to get their seeds. But by saving my own seeds, I'm going to ensure that I do have a reliable and dependable source of seeds for myself. Now let's walk around the garden a little bit. I'm going to show you some of the plants that I've been saving seeds from, and we'll talk a little bit about how I've been doing it. Now take a look at this. This was actually a kale plant that overwintered from last year, and kale in its second year is going to try to go to seed. So all of these here are filled with seeds. You can see there's some kale seeds there. Now I didn't do anything to prevent cross-pollination, so this could be a mix of multiple kinds of kale. Now, if your goal is just to grow food, you don't need to worry about cross-pollination. You can just save the seeds from any ripe fruit, like this tomato here. I didn't do anything to prevent cross-pollination for this tomato. So this tomato most likely has seeds inside it that are a mix. But if my goal is only to get tomatoes, then saving seeds from this is fine. They'll still be edible. They'll most likely still be delicious. They just won't necessarily be completely true to the parent plant. Now here's a beautiful example of a lettuce plant that's gone to seed. Now this plant started off just as the little rosette of lettuce leaves that we're probably all familiar with growing. But as it matured and bolted, it developed a big cluster of yellow flowers that kind of opened one at a time. And each of those flowers turns into a little seed puff. And so all of these seeds in here can turn into a lettuce plant. So each of these little puffs probably has a minimum of 5 seeds, maybe up to 15 or so. So think of how many lettuce plants you can get from just this one lettuce plant here. Now I may at some point do a more in-depth video that really focuses on the details of seed saving. If that's something that you guys want to see, leave a comment and let me know. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to do a really quick overview of saving seeds. And basically what you need to know to save seeds to grow food is any ripe fruit should have viable seeds in it. Now there's things you can do to prevent cross-pollination. There's discussion of saving seeds from an heirloom or open pollinated plant versus a hybrid plant. But just for the purposes of food security, just know that any ripe fruit, so when I say ripe fruit, I mean like a tomato at the point that you would eat it will have viable seeds. Now a pepper, it depends. If you eat your peppers green, those are not mature fruits from the plant's perspective, and they're probably not going to have viable seeds. So to save seeds from a pepper, you want to wait until it has really achieved its mature color. In many cases that's red, could be orange, yellow, depending on the type of pepper that you're growing. There's many fruits that we normally eat immature, like cucumbers, summer squash. Those fruits are harvested when they've just barely started to develop from the plant's point of view. If you let those plants go, you'll see that they're going to get much larger. I'm sure most of us have probably had the experience of leaving a zucchini for a few extra days and you end up with something like the size of a baseball bat. So the zucchinis that we normally harvest, 6, 8, maybe 10 inches long, those are very immature fruits. If you want to save zucchini seeds, you're going to need to let your zucchini continue to develop the way you would let a winter squash develop. It's going to get a hard outer rind. It's going to be very mature. It's not really most likely going to be very good for eating. But from the plant's point of view, that is a mature fruit, and that is what you need to save the seeds from. So the third step that I'm taking in my garden this year for food security is growing more storage varieties. Now this is a little different for me because we normally kind of focus on more fresh eating. We really rely on our garden a lot during the summer. And then, while we have some stuff that we store and preserve, a lot of our winter produce we kind of source from the grocery store, and that is something that we're trying to move away from. We're trying to source more of our own winter produce from our own garden this year. I'm kind of just taking a small step in that direction. We're not growing enough to really meet all of our winter produce needs, but I'm taking a step in that direction, and every little step is something. Every food that you grow is something that you're not getting from the supply chain. Everything that you grow is something that is growing local and not being trucked across the country. Eventually, we would love to be able to produce all of our own produce. That's going to be a little ways down the road, but we're just taking steps as we go to get closer to that goal. So I'm just going to take you guys around. I'm going to show you a few of the storage varieties that we've added this year. Now you can see I have a big pot here overflowing with sweet potatoes. You probably actually can't even see the pot, but this is a really large pot and I have several sweet potato plants in here and they're really taking over. I also have one more smaller pot with sweet potatoes. Now this is not enough sweet potatoes to meet our sweet potato needs for the year. It's some sweet potatoes that we're not going to have to buy, and it's going to give us a little bit more food security. Now here you can see I have a beautiful butternut squash plant. This plant I planted a little bit late and it hasn't really started flowering yet. You can see it's starting to get some of its male flowers. They're not open yet, but this is a really fast maturing butternut squash variety, and I think that we should be able to get a harvest from this before frost. If not, because it's in a pot, I can bring into my house to finish ripening. We have several butternut squashes growing, some in pots on my deck, some out in the garden. I think total we probably have about 8 or 10 plants. So we should be able to get enough butternut squash to give us a little bit of produce to store over the winter. You can see in this pot here, I have a couple sugar pie pumpkin plants growing. Now again, I started these a little bit late. We don't have pumpkins yet, but we should have enough time left to get a few sugar pie pumpkins before frost. So again, I have this pot here that has 2 plants in it. I have a little no-dig garden area that I just added this year that has some butternut squash and some pumpkins growing. And I have a few more pumpkin plants out in my garden. Look at that beautiful flower. This one hasn't had female flowers yet, but hopefully very soon. Now it is the beginning of August. Depending on your specific growing conditions in your area, that's going to affect what storage crops you can still plant at this time. Now, some plants are great for fall gardening. Carrots make a great storage crop and they're great for the fall garden. Cabbage can make, depending on the variety, can make a great storage crop, and that's another great plant for the fall garden. Now, if you have a little bit of a longer growing season and your frost isn't going to be till, say, probably sometime in November, you could definitely get away with planting a fast maturing winter squash variety as well. That butternut squash that I showed you is 75 days from seed to harvest. Now, of course, as your days get shorter, as it gets a little cooler out, your plants are going to slow down a little bit. So it's probably going to be a little bit more than 75 days for me. But at the time that I planted that, that was enough for me to get a harvest. Here in Connecticut, we usually get a frost around mid-October. So if you're somewhere that has a little bit longer of a growing season, you could definitely still plant that kind of plant as well. Now, you just want to look into how you're going to store these vegetables. These are vegetables that don't need preservation, which is a great thing, but a lot of them do need to be stored a certain way for a long shelf life. And some of them need to be cured a certain way for the longest shelf life as well. So depending on what vegetables you are looking at growing, just do your research and figure out where and how you're going to store those vegetables and where and how you're going to cure them for the best storage life possible. Now, one storage crop that I do grow every year, so this isn't something new for me, is garlic. You can see I have my garlic just hanging in my garage, and throughout the winter, we'll pull garlic from this stash, and this will last, in my experience, it'll last until we run out, usually sometime in February or maybe March. Now, it's too late to plant garlic to get a harvest this year, but actually fall is the best time to plant garlic to get a harvest next summer. So if you're thinking about growing garlic, now is the time to think about getting seed garlic. These here are the garlic heads that I've saved for planting. So you can see these are the ones with the biggest cloves. They may not all be the biggest heads, but they have the biggest cloves. We'll talk more about planting garlic when I actually plant this garlic, which for me will probably be late October, early November. I'll do a video all about how to plant garlic then. But for now, just be looking for a source for seed garlic if that's something you're interested in growing. So the fourth thing that I'm doing in my garden this year for food security is that I am focusing a little bit more on growing varieties specifically for preserving. Now you can see here, I have a second crop of tomatoes growing. These are my fall tomatoes. This is a bit of a risk and a bit of an experiment that I'm taking. I'm going to link the video below in the video description where I planted these tomatoes and I talk a little bit about what I'm doing and why. But for the purposes of this video, just know that these tomatoes here are a determinate sauce tomato. And while most of the tomatoes in my garden I'm kind of growing for fresh eating, we'll probably dehydrate some cherry tomatoes and maybe freeze a couple of the other tomatoes to preserve later. But this crop here, the exclusive purpose of these tomatoes is for preservation. So these are a determinate tomato, which are all going to be ripe at about the same time. and it's a fairly fast maturing variety. So most likely, assuming my weather cooperates here in Connecticut, we have kind of unpredictable weather. I think that's probably true of most of the country to some extent or another. But these tomatoes here are reserved for preserving. I'm hoping to make some crushed tomatoes with these. I'm hoping to can some salsa with these. So these are extra tomatoes that I wouldn't normally grow. I'm growing these just for the purpose of preserving to give us some fresh food from our garden over the winter months. Now, if you've been following along with me for a while, you know that my cucumbers this year really got off to a rocky start. We had a lot of cucumber issues, and I'm hoping that now we're finally getting into the swing of really growing cucumbers. But a lot of the cucumbers that I'm growing this year are specific pickling varieties. I'm growing more than usual, and I'm growing a lot of pickling types because I'm hoping to be able to preserve more cucumbers, make some more pickles, and again, give us another source of garden fresh produce over the winter. Now you can see my zucchini plant in here. This has actually seen better days. This one's actually kind of a little past peak here. You can see we've got a little zucchini down in there that's almost ready to harvest. But I'm growing extra zucchini this year, and the reason that I'm doing that is because I like to grate and freeze zucchini and keep it in my freezer, and then I have lots of homegrown zucchini to use in baking over the winter. When you freeze it, you can grate it and freeze it, and then it's great to use in baking or in soups and stews and dishes like that. Now you'll notice that I have a lot of kale growing in my garden, probably more than I really need for fresh eating during the season. You'll also notice that a lot of these plants are missing a really large amount of their bottom leaves here. That's because I've been harvesting this kale as we go, not just for fresh eating, but I've also been harvesting it and dehydrating some of the leaves into powder, and I've been freezing a lot of it. Now, we don't use a lot of kale fresh during the season, but what we do like to do is freeze a lot of our kale. You can see some of the bugs have been enjoying my kale as well, probably as much as we have. And so I like to freeze it. And then once you've frozen it in a Ziploc baggie, you can just take it out and crumble it up and put it right into winter soups and stews, and it's delicious. And it's a great way to get some fresh greenery during the time when you don't have a lot growing in your garden. So as you can see, now we're out here in my raspberry patch. As you can see, most of my summer raspberries have already been harvested. We're kind of in that lull between the summer raspberries and the fall raspberries, but we will have some more coming. Now, while the fresh fruit doesn't store very long at all, they're an excellent candidate for freezing. So we harvested lots of fresh raspberries this summer. We did eat a lot of them fresh, but I also froze a couple bags of them, so that will give us something to pull out in the winter. And we are going to get a second crop of raspberries in the late summer to early fall. That crop is usually actually even bigger than the summer crop, so we should be able to put up some more raspberries for freezing as well. And definitely don't feel like you have to limit yourself to preserving only what you grow in your own garden. The farmer's market can be a great option to find lots of food to preserve. Even the grocery store, if you find a great deal on produce and you want to learn how to preserve food, or you just want to store up some food to have, the grocery store produce is a great way to learn. So while we were able to preserve some of our own raspberries because we have such a nice big raspberry crop here, we don't grow enough blueberries or strawberries to have enough extra to preserve. So we did go to a local farm. We picked lots of strawberries there, and we froze a few bags of strawberries. We picked lots of blueberries, and we froze a whole bunch of bags of blueberries. So we have lots of berries put up, and we didn't grow most of them. So don't feel like you have to be limited to preserving only what you grow yourself. Now, the fifth step I'm taking in my garden this year to increase my food security is succession sowing. This is something I do a little bit every year, but I've been a little more serious about it this year. Succession sowing basically means that you don't plant all of your plants at once. You're going to stagger the planting throughout the growing season. And when a plant is done producing, you pull it out and then you replace it with something that will produce in the time that you have left in your growing season. So I'm just going to take you through the garden. I'm going to show you some of the ways that I'm using succession sowing to really increase the amount of harvest that I'm getting in the small garden that I have. Now, a lot of people probably would not consider this a small garden, but because I want a garden that, I would love to have a garden that's at least twice this size. To me, it's a small garden compared to the ideal garden that I am envisioning in my mind. So succession sowing is important to maximize your space, to maximize your harvest, and to maximize your food security. So I'm going to take you through my garden. I'm going to show you some of the succession sowing techniques that we're using in the garden and the crops that I've succession sown. Now this garden bed here you can see is mostly bare. This is where I had all my lettuce growing all spring and into the summer, but it all bolted and turned bitter, and we're pretty much done with lettuce now with how hot it is. But you can see here, I have some bush beans growing. So I pulled out the lettuce, I replaced some of that with bush beans, Over here, I've planted some zucchinis. You can see they have not sprouted yet, but there will be zucchinis here. But I'm also going to be filling in this bed with some heat-tolerant lettuces that will hopefully get us through the rest of summer. We'll be harvesting those pretty quickly. I'm also going to be putting in some varieties that are specific for fall and winter, and those will help us extend our growing season even past the first frost. Now over here, we're back in my kale bed. You can see this whole bare spot here. I had cauliflower growing here. Once my cauliflower yielded, I pulled it out because cauliflower is only going to be a one and done crop. And you can see I put some new zucchini seeds in. They have a really short days to maturity, so these will yield before my frost. And that makes the best use of this space here. As opposed to leaving this space bare and unproductive, we're going to put some zucchinis here. We're going to get some more zucchinis that we can grate up and freeze for winter harvest, and maybe a few for eating fresh. I've also sprinkled some new kale seeds at the base of these kale plants. I just did that a couple days ago, so I don't see any germination yet, but that will give us some fall kale. Over here, you can see I have some bush beans that are kind of on their way out. These are still productive. You can see they're getting flower for basically a second flush of beans, but they're on their way out. And down on the end here, I had more bush beans that are completely done. You can see they've pretty much succumbed to the heat and their age and just kind of dried up. So I replaced them with some sugar pie pumpkin plants, which hopefully these will have enough time to yield before frost. But we've got two little plants there. This space was going to be used by nothing, so taking a risk with my sugar pie pumpkins is better than the guaranteed harvest of nothing that I would get if I just let the spot stay bare. So you got a quick glimpse of my fall tomatoes earlier, but what I didn't tell you before was that this bed was where I grew my garlic. So garlic gets harvested in the middle of summer, and then you still have half the growing season left to grow something in, and who wants to leave that space bare? So I had started these fall tomatoes in pots on my deck, and as soon as I harvested my garlic, I mended the soil and replanted it with these fall tomatoes. Now, mending the soil is one of the keys to be successful with succession planting. Once you have a plant there that's lived its life and yielded its harvest, it's also taken a lot of the nutrients out of the soil, and there isn't as much left to feed a new plant. So you're going to want to go ahead and amend that soil with compost, fertilizer, just something that will give the new plants some nutrients to grow. So when I pulled out the garlic that used to be in that bed behind me, I added a really thick layer of compost before I planted my tomatoes. And then when I planted my tomatoes, I gave each of them a little handful of organic fertilizer, kind of slow release fertilizer, to feed them over the course of their lives. Now, when it comes to succession sowing and maximizing your harvest, sometimes you have to make some tough decisions. You can see behind me, I have some broccoli plants. Now these broccoli plants already yielded their main head. They already yielded a lot of side shoots. Now see, they are still producing some more side shoots. You see that little guy in there? But I'm going to have to make the decision to pull these broccoli plants out, even though they are still producing. The thing is that their production has slowed down. If I leave them in here all season, I will get a few more handfuls of little side shoots. And by pulling them early, I am robbing myself of some of the harvest that I could be getting. But sometimes you need to ask yourself which is going to give you the greater harvest. Am I going to get the greater harvest from leaving these broccolis in and getting the last few side shoots that they'll produce? Or will I get the greater harvest from pulling it out and planting something else in its space to make the most use of the time that I have left in my growing season? And in this case, I think that what I'm going to do is pull this broccoli and replant it with some fall crops. Now here you can see I have a lot of little baby snap peas growing up along this fence. This was a situation where I had to make that same decision. My spring peas were still here. They were still producing a little bit, but their production had gone way down. By pulling them out, I sacrificed basically the few handfuls of snap peas that we would have still gotten in favor of having enough time to be able to plant these peas to get a fall harvest. So I pulled them out, sacrificed those little bit of peas, and now we should, if everything goes well, get a nice big harvest of fall snap peas. Now the sixth thing I'm doing in my garden this year to increase food security is season extension. Now this is something, again, I've kind of dabbled in this in the past, but I'm going to try to be a little more serious about it this year. So season extension basically means growing plants outside the season that you could normally grow them. Now here in Connecticut, we have a fairly short growing season. Our first frost usually comes in early to mid-October, and then we don't have our last frost until the middle of May. So that gives us more than half the year that we cannot grow frost-sensitive crops. Now, with season extension, you're not going to be able to, say, grow a tomato in January unless you have supplemental lighting and heating and all kinds of stuff that's going to get really expensive really fast. That would be the dream, to be able to do that, but that's just not the reality for me or probably for most people either. But what I am going to do is some really simple, basic, low-tech season extension that is going to allow me to be able to grow frost-hardy crops. Now, that's That's fall crops. That's things like lettuce, kale, cabbage, carrots, lots of greens, scallions, parsley, things like that that can survive a light frost. What we can do is give them an ideal growing condition that will allow them to survive a little bit longer. So that will give us a few more weeks of harvest. In some cases, you can actually keep these plants alive all winter long. A lot of this is going to depend on your specific climate and growing conditions. But I mean, I think here in Connecticut, we have, I know our winters are nothing compared to, say, Alaska or Minnesota or some places like that, but we do have pretty serious winters here in New England. And I have been able to keep some really tough lettuces going all year. So I'm just going to show you a little preview of what we'll be doing for our season extension this year. Now, I showed you guys a real brief glimpse of this garden bed back here. Admittedly, right now, it does not look the most beautiful. This is where I had all my summer lettuce growing, because it's been consistently in the 90s lately here in Connecticut. Lettuce is pretty much done for the season. I do have some bush beans succession sowed, but what I'm going to do, this is going to become one of my fall harvest beds. You can see that I have these hoops here. I use these for several things in my garden. One is preventing insects. You can kind of lay an insect netting over them. But what's relevant to this video is that I'm going to be covering this little hoop tunnel with greenhouse plastic. Now, when the fall growing season really arrives and our first frost is about to come, I will show you guys how I set up this hoop tunnel. I'll show you how I set up the hoops that are there now, and I'll show you how I put greenhouse plastic over them. But what you want to be doing right now to prepare for that is to be looking at what plants are frost hardy, what plants are going to grow in your area through at least the fall and hopefully part of the winter as well. Some great suggestions to look at are winter lettuces, spinach, arugula, kale. Mosh is a great one. It's very small, but it can survive pretty much any temperature that we ever see here in Connecticut anyway. So take a look at plants like that. Carrots can store exceptionally well in the ground if you have the right variety of carrots. What you want to be doing right now is researching what plants will grow well in your area in the cold temperatures, and you want to be getting seeds for those plants so that you're ready to grow them. Now, another way that you can extend the season is to grow inside a little bit. I know most of us probably don't really have a lot of space for growing inside, but I like to do microgreens, and I also like to do sprouts. So those are two things that I will definitely be doing in the winter to really increase my harvest during the winter months. So when the time comes, I'll show you guys how I do microgreens and how I do sprouts, and hopefully that will be something that you'll be inspired to try as well. So the final step I'm taking in my garden that I want to leave you with today is to not waste anything. Now, when we use our food, there always seems to be something that's kind of a scrap, a leftover, something that we don't really need for our main purpose. You can always compost that stuff, and that is a great option, and that is what I do for things that don't fall into these other categories. But there are some other great ways that you can use your food scraps besides composting. So I'm just going to take you through my garden, and I'm going to show you a few of the steps that I take. If you have any other ways that you recommend, kind of unexpected ways to use some of your food scraps, leave a comment and let me know, because I'm always looking for new ways to use up some of my food scraps. So I look forward to learning some of your tips as well. So let me take you through the garden and I'll show you some of my tips. Now, when it comes to things like scallions and onions, we mostly just use the bulb or the white part, but these green leaves have lots of flavor too. These can be dehydrated and made into a delicious green onion powder. They can also make a great green for pesto. You can kind of stretch out your basil by including onion tops in it as well, which gives it a little bit of a nice oniony flavor and just makes another delicious way to eat them. So you can see a few of my canning tomatoes are just starting to blush here. Now, when you can tomatoes, you usually remove the skins and discard them, but you can actually dehydrate those skins and make delicious tomato powder. That will be a good seasoning for a lot of your other foods that you cook. When we pull out this broccoli, like I mentioned before, this will be going to the chickens. The chickens can pick through and eat whatever they want from these leaves. If they find any bugs lurking in these leaves, that will be a delicious treat for them too. And then the chickens will take this garden waste and turn it into fresh compost for us. Now, ultimately, there will be some parts of your garden that you really can't use for anything else. These broccoli stalks will be too tough for my chickens to eat, and we can't really use them in broth because the broccoli flavor, at least in my opinion, doesn't really give a good flavor to broth. So these are going to be composted. Even this doesn't get wasted. This will get composted and turned into nutrients for next year's garden. So one more great way to make the most of some of your vegetable scraps is to save them for broth. I keep a little Ziploc baggie in my freezer of onion tops, carrot peels, celery ends, parsley stems, oregano stems. So pretty much any type of flavor that you'd use in a broth. Save the scraps from that vegetable and put it in a freezer bag. And then when you go to make chicken broth or bone broth, you don't have to use a fresh onion. You don't have to cut parsley from your garden. you don't have to cut up a carrot. You have all those vegetable scraps in your freezer, and that frees up those other vegetables to be used for something else. So here's a bag of the scraps that I use. You can see I've got bits of onion in there. I've got some parsley stems. I've got, this one looks to be mostly onions. Save the skins too. What I usually do is the very outer layer of skin that can be kind of dirty, I usually peel that off and compost it. But underneath, there's usually 1 or 2 more layers of skin. Those will be protected from dirt. And those have great vitamins in them. They have great color in them. They'll give your broth a nice color and some great flavor too. All of that stuff can really be saved and used to make a delicious broth. So you can see I have some oregano that I'm drying here. Once this is fully dry, I'm going to remove the leaves and crumble them up and put them in a spice jar. But all of these stems here will still have great flavor. So all of these stems will go into my broth bag and be turned into bone broth later in the year. I'm also going to show you guys one more bonus. This is not technically from the garden, but this is still a great way to make the most use of your food. This entire jar here, as you can see, this is bacon fat. So when I cook with bacon, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll get multiple packages of bacon from the grocery store. I'll chop them up and I'll cook them all at once, and then I'll store that cooked bacon in my freezer. It makes it really easy to just throw a little bit on pizza, to throw a little bit in a quiche, something like that. Where you need a little bit of cooked bacon, it's a great time saver. But when you cook a lot of bacon like that, you're going to end up with a lot of bacon fat. So I have this jar here of bacon fat. If you're going to use it right away, go ahead and store it in your fridge. This was actually, I cooked probably 5 or 6 packages of bacon at once. I had a lot. So this went into my freezer. And you can just pull it out when you need it. This is a great alternative to saute vegetables in. Sometimes I like to use olive oil or butter. Sometimes I use bacon fat when I want a little extra flavor. This is a great money saver and a great way to make the most of all of the food that comes into your house. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about the 7 steps that I'm taking in my garden this year to increase my food security. Some of these are really small steps, but you know every step makes a difference. And even a small step in the right direction still moves you in that right direction that you're trying to go. So even if a step that you're taking seems small, if it's going in the direction that you want to go, I encourage you to take that step. So I hope that you're encouraged to try 1 or more of these steps that I'm taking as well. If you have any more tips that you want to recommend for easy ways to increase your food security in your garden, leave them below because I would love to get more tips. I'm sure everyone watching this video would love to get more tips as well. And I look forward to hearing from you and hearing your input. So I hope that you're all having a great day. I hope that your gardens are wonderful and abundant, and I hope that you're ready to just take those steps and increase your food security, because food security is never a bad thing. More homegrown food is never a bad thing. Eating fresh food from our gardens in the middle of winter is a great thing. So I hope that you're encouraged to give it a try, and I hope you're having a great day. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye. See you next time.